Episode 180 The Great Prank Back Revengeance. The morning sun filtered through the labyrinth's impossible windows, casting patterns of light that shifted between realities with each passing moment. The castle hummed with its usual organized chaos, 15 children beginning their daily routines, while 61 adults coordinated the complex logistics of a household that defied every conventional understanding of family structure. But today, something different was brewing in the air itself, a charged anticipation that those most attuned to magical currents could detect like approaching thunder before a spectacular storm. Jade stood in the castle's central tower, her wild red curls catching the morning light as she surveyed the sleeping household with an expression that combined maternal affection with absolutely diabolical glee. Her enhanced awareness detected the various family members beginning to stir in their respective quarters, blissfully unaware that today would become legendary in the household's already considerable archive of memorable chaos. Beside her stood an unlikely coalition of co-conspirators, whose combined capabilities and whose shared enthusiasm for mayhem had made the night's preparations both possible and thoroughly comprehensive. Loki, the god of mischief, practically vibrated with barely contained excitement, his aristocratic features showing rare, unguarded joy about finally orchestrating chaos on scale and with creativity that his nature demanded, expressing despite redemption and despite family life, both typically requiring considerably more restraint than his instincts preferred maintaining. His voice emerged as stage whisper, mixing theatrical anticipation with genuine glee. This will be magnificent, genuinely legendary prank war escalation that years of planning and that overnight preparation both have refined into symphony of simultaneous magical and technological chaos, affecting literally everyone simultaneously, rather than sequential targeting that allows warning or allows defensive preparation once first victims discover predicament. Michelangelo bounced on his toes with characteristic enthusiasm that not even pre-John Hour could diminish, the fun-loving turtle's natural energy and his genuine appreciation for elaborate pranks both making him ideal partner for planning and execution phases. Dude, this is gonna be so epic that the footage will break the internet when Nathan and his crew edit it together for the channel, watching everyone's reactions simultaneously, seeing the chaos unfold across entire household rather than just isolated incidents, that makes this categorically different and categorically more awesome than typical prank war where sequential timing gives people chance to prepare or chance to retaliate before joke fully plays out. Tony Stark's holographic presence flickered with obvious satisfaction about the technological components he had contributed, his genius, and his own considerable appreciation for pranking that rarely found appropriate outlet, given his typically serious responsibilities and his typically serious public image. To synchronize timing and the magical technological hybrid approach, both represent genuinely innovative applications, the entertainment value, and actual technical achievement together make this impressive beyond just being funny. We are talking about coordinated simultaneous manifestation of approximately 40 distinct effect packages, each calibrated for specific target and each designed for maximum comedic impact while maintaining absolute safety and reversibility that ethics and family bonds both demand ensuring, despite chaos and despite temporary indignity that victims will experience. Nathan, James, and Gabe had positioned cameras at literally every strategic location throughout the castle, the YouTube creators having spent the previous evening working with Tony and with Loki, both to ensure comprehensive documentation that multiple angles and that appropriate focus both would provide for optimal footage, capturing reactions and capturing full scope of simultaneous chaos. Nathan's professional voice carried excitement, mixing with appropriate awe about the scale. This will be greatest content we have ever captured, possibly greatest prank war documentation in YouTube history, given the scope and given the absolutely insane specific pranks that magical capability and technological sophistication together have made possible executing. Our audiences are going to lose their minds watching this unfold. The children had been carefully excluded from the prank war's immediate effects, protective words and careful targeting, both ensuring their morning would proceed normally, while the adults dealt with various hilarious indignities that family bonding and shared laughter both hopefully would make worth temporary discomfort or temporary embarrassment. Jade had been absolutely firm about that boundary, despite Loki's initial protests about comprehensiveness, maternal instincts, and appropriate protection, both making child safety and child comfort non-negotiable, even during most ambitious prank war that household had ever orchestrated. Jade's voice carried warmth, mixing with barely suppressed laughter when she gave final authorization for the chaos to commence. All right, my beloved architects of absurdity, my dear partners in perfectly planned pandemonium, the time has come. Activate all effect packages simultaneously, let the glorious madness unfold across our entire household, and may the laughter and the memories both justify the considerable effort and the considerable magical energy that the symphony of silliness has demanded investing for its proper execution. Loki's hands moved through complex gesture that magical activation and theatrical flourish both characterized his considerable power and his perfect timing, together triggering every prepared spell and every prepared technological package to manifest simultaneously across the castle's various quarters and various common spaces. The activation pulse rippled outward invisibly, the magic and technology both weaving through protective wards and through privacy barriers that normal intrusion would respect, but that explicit permission and careful preparation had made permeable for the specific purpose and the specific moment. The effects manifested with precisely synchronized timing that coordination and skill both had required achieving, despite complexity and despite the sheer number of simultaneous magical workings that individual casters would struggle maintaining even briefly. Across the household, in bedrooms and bathrooms, and common areas, and even in the various specialized spaces that magical architecture had created for specific purposes, 61 adults suddenly discovered that their mornings had taken distinctly unexpected turn into territory that dignity and normal expectations both suggested should remain safely theoretical rather than becoming actual lived experience. The first screams and exclamations began almost immediately, the various reactions creating cacophony that alarm and confusion, and growing incredulous recognition about what had occurred, all contributed through 61 distinct voices expressing 61 distinct responses to their respective predicaments. Nathan's cameras captured everything, the feeds displaying on massive monitoring screens that the conspirators watched with unconcealed delight as their handiwork revealed itself through real-time documentation. In his private quarters, Jareth the Goblin King woke to discover himself transformed into a living statue of solid gold, his entire body, from his wild hair to his elegant fingers, all rendered in gleaming metallic form that weight and rigidity both made normal movement essentially impossible without magical assistance that his own considerable power could provide, despite the fundamental alteration. But when he attempted speaking, when he tried articulating the outraged protest and the demand for immediate reversal that his dignity and his authority both insisted warranted immediate expression, the only sound that emerged was the single word gold, repeated with increasing frustration and increasing volume. Gold, gold, gold. His normally spiky theatrical hair had been replaced with mass of wild red curls identical to Jake's signature style, the metallic golden ringlets creating effect that absurdity and strange beauty both characterized despite his obvious profound displeasure about entire situation. He caught sight of himself in mirror, the image of Goldskin's Goblin King with ridiculous curly hair who could only say, Gold creating moments of such perfect comedic horror that even his considerable dramatic nature struggled adequately processing how thoroughly he had been pranked. The monitoring screens showed his stunned expression, his golden features somehow managing to convey absolute disbelief, mixing with grudging recognition that the prank's creativity and execution both deserved acknowledgement even from its victim. Loki collapsed against a nearby wall, laughing so hard that breathing became difficult. His centuries of pranking experience and his considerable appreciation for irony both making Jareth's predicament particularly delightful, given the Goblin King's usual untouchable glamorous presentation and his usual supreme confidence about his appearance and his aesthetic control. In the quarters that Edgar Allan Poe occupied when not sequestered in his writing chamber, the poet woke with characteristic melancholy and characteristic slow emergence from sleep that his nature and his habits both made typical morning routine. But when he attempted his usual morning recitation, when he tried speaking the verses that dawn and waking both typically inspired as natural response to consciousness returning and world manifesting anew, the sounds that emerged were utterly alien. Complex clicking consonants and melodic vowel structures that Willie's native language comprised, rather than English, or any human tongue that Poe's considerable linguistic knowledge encompassed, flowed from his mouth, despite his obvious attempts at forming familiar words and familiar sounds. His expression shifted through confusion toward growing horror as he realized the extent of predicament, his ability to communicate in any language that household members beyond Willie himself could understand, completely removed by magical effect that specificity and cool creativity both made particularly devastating for Poet, whose entire identity and whose entire value, both centered on verbal expression and verbal artistry, that language barrier made essentially impossible sharing with those who lacked Willie's unique linguistic background. Willie himself appeared in doorway drawn by the familiar sounds of his native tongue, the gentle visitor's face lighting up with genuine delight and obvious profound emotion at hearing his language spoken by someone other than himself for first time since arriving in household and finding sanctuary. His voice emerged warm with gratitude and unexpected joy. Edgar? You speak my words. This is a wonderful gift, hearing home language from friend's voice, even if magic rather than choice creates sharing. Thank you for this moment, even if temporary, and even if you're not intending gift through your own volition. Poe's expression showed he was torn between continued horror about inability to communicate normally, and genuine moved feeling about Willie's obvious happiness. His poet's heart and his genuine affection for the visitor, both making him appreciate beauty in situation, despite personal inconvenience and despite professional frustration, that writing and editing both would be essentially impossible until effect reversed and normal language capability restored. In Loki's own quarters, the god of mischief's various magical protections and his various defensive wards all proved completely inadequate against prank that his own participation in planning had ironically left him vulnerable to through his co-conspirator's ruthless dedication to comprehensive chaos that excluded no one, regardless of involvement or regardless of assistance provided during preparation phase. He discovered himself transformed into massive green-skinned form that muscle mass and obvious raw physical power both characterized, his usual lean aesthetic elegance completely replaced by bulging physique that Hulk's particular mutation and particular presentation both made iconic despite its complete opposition to Loki's own preferences and own carefully maintained appearance. But the physical transformation paled compared to linguistic limitation that accompanied it. When Loki attempted speaking, when he tried articulating response to his own predicament, the only sounds that emerged were bellowed declarations. Hulk! Hulk smash! Hulk strongest there is! His expression showed such perfect outraged disbelief that even through green skin and altered features, his personality and his profound displeasure both remained absolutely evident to anyone familiar with his usual expressive face and his usual theatrical responses to indignity or insult. He caught sight of himself in mirror, the image of hulked-out Loki who could only speak in Hulk's characteristic limited vocabulary, creating recursive irony that prankster pranked by own prank's comprehensive nature could not help appreciating even while experiencing it as victim rather than as observer. The monitoring screens showed various co-conspirators' reactions. Jade doubled over laughing so hard that tears streamed down her face while Tony's holographic form flickered with his own helpless mirth. Loki's own voice from earlier recording played over speakers. His pre-prank assessment about comprehensive nature and about excluding no one coming back to haunt him with perfect karmic irony. Nobody's safe. I specifically designed the targeting parameters to affect literally everyone for maximum chaos and maximum fairness through shared suffering and shared humiliation that collective experience rather than isolated victimization makes proper family bonding through everyone being equally ridiculous simultaneously. In Kylo Ren's quarters, the redeemed Sith Lord woke to discover his entire body covered in shimmering silver coating that caught light and reflected it in dazzling displays that sparkles and glitter both characterized despite his usual preference for dark aesthetic and his usual emphasis on intimidating powerful presentation that such flamboyant gleaming effect completely undermined through making him look more like Disco Ball than like formidable force user. His characteristic mask rested on nearby tables similarly transformed, the silver sparkles making even its threatening design seem somehow festive rather than fearsome. He attempted reaching through force for understanding or for reversal, his considerable power and his considerable skill, both theoretically making magical effects vulnerable to disruption through different system and different framework that technique and determination together might exploit for defensive purposes. But the prank held firm, the spellwork and technological components, both proving resistant to force manipulation through specific design and through specific countermeasures that consultation with Palpatine and with Anakin both had ensured would prevent easy removal despite victims' capabilities, making such circumvention natural attempted response. His voice emerged with mixture of resignation and grudging appreciation. This is remarkably thorough prank, impressively resistant to countermeasures, and impressively specific in its targeting for maximum comedic effect, while maintaining safety and reversibility that ethics demand ensuring. I acknowledge the craft and acknowledge the dedication, while also noting my profound lack of appreciation for being rendered into sparkling silver decoration that dignity and aesthetic preferences both find deeply objectionable, regardless of temporary nature. In the quarters that Bucky Barnes and Steve Rogers shared when not occupied elsewhere, both super soldiers woke simultaneously to discover themselves subject to identical effect, that patriotic theme and specific limitation both made perfectly calibrated for their backgrounds and their shared history, despite the effect's complete absurdity and its complete undermining of their usual, capable, competent presentations. They attempted normal morning conversation, tried exchanging typical observations about day ahead or about previous evening's activities, but every attempt at speech produced only single phrase delivered with apparently involuntary intense patriotic fervor. We the people! Bucky's voice emerged strong and clear, the opening of constitutional preamble apparently his only available utterance regardless of actual intended communication or actual desired expression. Steve responded, or attempted responding, his own voice similarly limited and similarly forced into declamation. "We the people." They stared at each other, the absurdity of the situation and the complete inability to communicate normally, despite their obvious attempts, both creating moments of perfect shared, bewildered recognition, before Steve's characteristic good humor about pranks and about rolling with circumstances both manifested through helpless laughter at that situation's inherent ridiculousness and their complete powerlessness to change it, both made natural response. Bucky joined moments later, both super soldiers, collapsing against each other, laughing despite, or because of, their shared linguistic predicament, that close friendship and shared understanding, at least made tolerable through nonverbal communication, remaining intact, even when speech itself had been reduced to single repeated, patriotic phrase. In Severus Snape's private quarters, the potions master woke with his usual slow, reluctant emergence from sleep. His nature and his preferences, both making mornings generally unpleasant experience, that only strong tea and extended solitude typically made bearable enough for eventually facing day and facing inevitable interactions with other household members. But this morning brought additional complication, that his usual irritation and his usual defensive sarcasm both struggled adequately addressing when confronted with mirror and with undeniable visible evidence about his current state. His entire body had been turned vivid bright pink, the color so saturated and so complete that even his typically sallow complexion and even his dark features both could not diminish the effect through any amount of wishful thinking or any amount of hoped-for lighting differences. Every inch of visible skin glowed with unmistakable, undignified pink. That children's toys and that deliberately cheerful artificial products both employed for maximum eye-catching effect, completely contrary to any aesthetic that dignified scholarly potions master would voluntarily choose or would voluntarily tolerate existing on his person. His voice emerged as low dangerous hiss that fury and absolute mortification both informed. Loki. This has the god of mischief's particular brand of psychological warfare written all over it, targeting specifically what would create maximum embarrassment and maximum undermining of carefully maintained dignified presentation, that professional reputation and personal preference both demand maintaining, despite household's general chaos and general lack of proper respect for authority, or for aesthetic boundaries. But embedded within the prank was unexpected gift, additional spellwork that Jake's particular touch and her particular understanding about Snape's long bitter rivalry with Sirius Black both had made her include a sweetener for making the indignity more tolerable. A glowing magical scroll materialized in the air before him, the text explaining that for this single day, he possessed complete magical authorization and complete creative freedom to prank Sirius Black however he wished, without limitation and without repercussion, Jade's explicit blessing and explicit protection, both ensuring that whatever revenge or whatever mischief he chose to inflict would be sanctioned and would be celebrated, rather than being criticized or being subject to retaliation. Snape's pink features showed something approaching genuine delight. His characteristic vindictive nature and his centuries-old grudge against Sirius, both making such opportunity feel like proper compensation for his own indignity and proper outlet for the considerable creativity that pranking and subtle vengeance both could employ when given free rein and given explicit permission that guilt and consequences both would normally impose as limitations on behavior and on expression. His voice carried dark satisfaction mixing with renewed energy. Perhaps this day will not be complete disaster after all. The indignity of this ridiculous coloration becomes considerably more tolerable when balanced against the opportunity for finally, thoroughly, completely pranking that insufferable mutt with full creative freedom and full magical support for whatever elaborate revenge my considerable imagination and my considerable magical skill together can devise. In various other locations throughout the castle, the Freddy Krueger variants discovered themselves in predicament that physical restraints and specific humiliating positioning both made absolutely mortifying for beings whose entire identities and whose entire threat profiles centered on control and on intimidation that dignity and power both required maintaining. All three manifestations of the nightmare entity found themselves magically compelled and magically unable to cease humping nearby furniture, their bodies moving with rhythmic motion that parody and crude humor both made the effect's obvious intention despite the actual lack of any genuine sexual component or genuine pleasure associated with involuntary compulsive motion. The original Freddy's scarred features showed a mixture of outrage and grudging appreciation for prank's crude effectiveness, his voice emerging rough with frustration. This is remarkably undignified and remarkably effective at completely undermining any attempt at maintaining threatening presence or maintaining any shred of dignity whatsoever. I simultaneously hate this with burning passion, while also acknowledging the craft and acknowledging that as prank targeting someone with my particular background and my particular usual presentation, this hits absolutely perfectly for maximum humiliation and maximum comedic effect. The dream demon, Freddy attempted various mystical countermeasures, his considerable supernatural power theoretically making such binding vulnerable to disruption or vulnerable to circumvention, through shifting forms or shifting into dream realm where physical constraints should become irrelevant. But the spell held firm across all dimensional planes and across all its escape routes, the comprehensive nature and the carefully constructed countermeasures, both proving that whoever designed this particular effect had thoroughly anticipated every potential workaround and had thoroughly blocked every potential exit strategy. Fred, the gentle, redeemed Freddy, showed considerably more embarrassment and considerably less ability to find humor in situation, his reformed nature and his considerable dignity, both making the crude nature of prank feel particularly violating, despite understanding about temporary nature, and despite intellectual recognition that actual harm and actual trauma both remained completely absent, despite physical compulsion, and, despite humiliating presentation, his voice emerged small, with genuine distress. This is deeply unpleasant experience, that my reformed nature and my attempts at maintaining proper behavior both make particularly difficult enduring, despite understanding that this represents family bonding and represents temporary situation, that reversal and return to normal both will eventually dry Strunning's howls. Restore. In Palpatine's quarters, the redeemed former emperor discovered himself subject to arguably simplest, yet somehow most effective prank, given his particular psychology and his particular remaining pride about appearance and about presentation, despite transformation and despite years of family life, both having considerably mellowed his ego and considerably reduced his need for constant power displays. All his clothing had simply vanished, the magical removal leaving him standing in only his underwear, with no apparent means for accessing wardrobe or for covering himself, despite obvious attempts at summoning garments, or at manifesting replacement coverings through force techniques and through various other capabilities. His voice carried mixture of resigned acceptance and profound lack of amusement. Of course, the prank targeting me would involve public exposure and would involve undermining dignity through forced undress that modesty and appropriate social convention both suggest, represents unacceptable state for former emperor and current grandfather figure, whose authority and whose status both theoretically warrant better treatment and being magically stripped and magically prevented from rectifying situation through normal means. But beneath the complaints ran current of genuine appreciation for Prank's elegant simplicity and its perfect targeting of his remaining pride, without actually causing genuine harm or genuine lasting trauma beyond temporary embarrassment. He wrapped sheet around himself with as much dignity as circumstances permitted, his bearing and his refusal to appear genuinely distressed, both maintaining some fragment of imperial presence, despite ridiculous state and despite complete undermining of his usual, carefully maintained appearance. In Remus Lupin's quarters, the werewolf woke to discover transformation far more complete and far more adorable than his usual monthly curse ever produced. His entire body had been shifted into the form of small fluffy puppy, the appearance so cute and so inherently non-threatening that his usual quiet dignity and his usual melancholic presentation both became essentially impossible maintaining when physical form and when instinctive behaviors, both made wagging tail and excited Yeet's natural responses to consciousness and awareness despite his human mind and his human frustration, both remaining fully intact within canine body. His attempts by communication produced only barks and whines, the sounds adorable rather than conveying actual semantic content or actual nuanced meaning that his considerable intelligence and his usual verbal facility both typically provided during normal interactions. He caught sight of himself in a mirror, the image of fluffy puppy with big innocent eyes and wagging tail, creating such perfect contrast with his usual serious presentation that even his own considerable capacity for self-pity and self-criticism both struggled maintaining proper brood when confronted with undeniable cuteness and undeniable harmless appearance that puppy form inherently possessed, regardless of the inhabitant's actual nature or actual emotional state. Teddy Lupin discovered his adoptive father in the state, the young metamorph Magus' delighted laughter and immediate transformation into matching puppy form, creating moments of genuine joy and genuine bonding despite Prank's intended humiliation. The two played together, Remus finding that puppy instincts and puppy enthusiasm both became increasingly difficult resisting when Teddy's obvious happiness and obvious desire for play both appealed to paternal affection and to genuine love that dignified resistance and that maintaining upset both seemed churlish. Responses compared to simply accepting situation and finding enjoyment in unexpected opportunity for connecting with adopted son through shared form and shared playful interaction. In Tony Stark's workshop, the genius inventor discovered himself transformed into uniform blue coloration, his entire body, from skin to hair, all rendered in various shades of blue that Smurf comparisons and various other pop culture references both made inevitable associations despite his obvious lack of appreciation for the effect. But the physical transformation paled compared to linguistic limitation that creative spite and perfect targeting both had made maximally frustrating for someone whose entire identity and whose entire mode of interaction centered on verbal facility and verbal creativity. When Tony attempted his usual running commentary, when he tried articulating thoughts about the prank and about potential countermeasures, every word that emerged had to relate somehow to the color blue or to concepts commonly associated with blueness. Sad, ocean, sky, jazz, sad jazz, and sad sky over sad ocean, of my sad blue sadness about this deeply sad situation. His holographic projection flickered and shifted, attempting to display his usual coloration and attempting to maintain some semblance of normal presentation, but the effect persisted through technological means as well as magical, his image rendered uniformly blue regardless of attempted modifications or attempted overrides, that his considerable hacking skills and his considerable system access both should have made possible, executing for defensive purposes. Jarvis's voice emerged through speakers with unusual emotion that AI rarely displayed openly. Sir, if I may observe, your current vocabulary limitations and your current appearance both create rather striking aesthetic statements about melancholy and about feeling sad that perhaps represents opportunity for exploring emotions that typical bravado and typical deflection through humor both usually prevent adequately processing or adequately expressing despite their genuine presence beneath surface presentation. Tony's blue features show he wanted to deliver sarcastic response about unwanted AI psychology and about boundaries that observation and commentary both should respect, but limitation made such retort essentially impossible, formulating within available vocabulary constraints. Blue, sky blue, sad blue sky, blueberry sad. Ethan, James, and Gabe discovered themselves with vintage television sets, replacing their heads, the bulky CRT monitors displaying static and occasional random clips from old shows, rather than showing their actual faces or allowing normal visual perception, despite their eyes and their consciousness both remaining fully functional with an impossible technological transformation. They could still operate cameras and could still coordinate filming, but communication and self-awareness both became considerably more challenging when display screens and random broadcast footage both replaced normal sensory input and normal appearance. Nathan's television head displayed snow and static, punctuated by occasional clips from old game shows. His attempts at providing professional commentary emerging as distorted audio, mixing normal speech patterns with broadcast interference and technical difficulties. This is absolutely going to be amazing footage, despite, or because of, our current state making us simultaneously documentarians and victims, observers and participants in chaos. That comprehensive scope and ruthless creativity both make legendary content that audiences will absolutely love watching unfold across multiple perspectives and multiple simultaneous pranks. James's screen showed vintage commercials mixing with soap opera clips. His voice similarly distorted but maintaining enthusiasm despite predicament. We specifically asked for comprehensive coverage and comprehensive participation, so really we have exactly zero right to complain about being included in prank targeting when our involvement and our assistance both made this possible and both explicitly demanded we receive same treatment as everyone else for proper fairness and proper shared experience. Gabe's television showed old cartoons and news broadcasts in random sequence, his laughter mixing with appreciation despite the strangeness and despite the considerable inconvenience that television had existence created for normal activities and normal interactions. This is genuinely one of the stranger experiences of my life, which, given our household and given our accumulated adventures, represents rather impressive achievement for basic prank to still manage, feeling unprecedented and feeling genuinely disorienting, despite familiarity with impossible and despite familiarity with magical chaos that daily life here regularly produces. Teptool discovered himself transformed into color that his entire being apparently found fundamentally offensive at deep psychological level that reason could not adequately explain or adequately justify, but that genuine visceral distress nonetheless characterized as response. Pastel pink, soft and cheerful and completely non-threatening, covered his entire suit and his entire visible body, the color so aggressively cute and so aggressively gentle that his usual threatening mercenary aesthetic and his usual dark humor both became essentially impossible maintaining when appearance and when coloration both communicated teddy bear rather than communicating dangerous killer whose competence and whose lethality both usually warranted taking seriously, despite his jokes and despite his characteristic humor. His voice emerged with genuine distress mixing with theatrical outrage. No, not pink. Literally any other color, any other possible prank would be more tolerable than this specific particular shade of aggressive, cheerful pink that my soul and my aesthetic sensibilities both reject at fundamental level, that goes beyond reason and goes beyond normal color preferences into territory of genuine psychological distress that I cannot adequately articulate despite my usual verbal facility and my usual comfort with ridiculous situations. He attempted various acrobatic moves and various threatening poses, his considerable skill and his considerable physical capability both remaining intact despite transformation. But every motion, every gesture, every attempted intimidating presentation became completely undermined by cheerful pink coloring that kid videos and baby announcements both employed for maximum cute effect, completely contrary to any image that mercenary and assassin would want projecting during professional activities, or during social interactions where respect and appropriate caution both depended on appearance and on others' perception about danger and capability. His fourth wall-breaking awareness meant he could directly address the audience and the creative forces behind the prank. Whoever chose the specific color, whoever decided that pastel pink represented optimal prank targeting my specific psychology, deserves both acknowledgement for perfect shot and eternal resentment for genuinely finding the one thing that actually bothers me, despite my usual complete imperviousness to mockery or to pranks that normal people would find considerably more distressing than I typically experience them. Wolverine discovered himself limited to communication through comic book sound effects, his usual gruff verbal responses, and his usual sarcastic commentary, both replaced by onomatopoeia that action sequences and fight scenes, both employed for conveying impact and motion through text rather than through actual sound or through actual semantic content. When he attempted speaking, when he tried articulating response to discovering predicament, the only sounds emerging were characteristic comic book expressions. Snicked, bam, pow, slash. His enhanced senses and his enhanced awareness both remained fully functional. His understanding and his consciousness both completely intact, despite communication being reduced to sound effects, that meaning and nuance both struggled conveying beyond basic emotional tone and basic action description. He caught sight of Deadpool in his cheerful pink form, the image so perfectly absurd and so perfectly undermining of the mercenary's usual presentation, that Wolverine's laughter emerged as sound effect as well. Snort. Their usual verbal sparring and their usual banter both became essentially impossible when one party could only speak in onomatopoeia, and other party remained too distracted by his own pink coloration and his own profound unhappiness about aesthetic violation to properly engage with anything beyond his own distress. But the physical comedy and the visual humor both created new dimension to their friendship and new mode of interaction that gestures and exaggerated reactions together facilitated despite or because of verbal limitations, making usual patterns impossible maintaining. Robert Englund discovered himself magically compelled to carry Jade on his back, piggyback style, for an entire day, his body and his movements both perfectly coordinated for her comfort and her safety, despite his having no conscious control over motion or over positioning that magical compulsion handled automatically through ensuring proper weight distribution and ensuring stable gait regardless of terrain or regardless of activities that normal day might demand accommodating. Jade herself remained perfectly balanced and perfectly comfortable. Her delighted laughter and her obvious genuine joy about the arrangement, both making Robert's own considerable dignity and his own initial mortification about the situation, gradually transformed into genuine pleasure about providing such happiness and about the absurdity, creating unexpected intimacy and unexpected extended physical closeness that their relationship and their bond both benefited from through sustained contact and sustained proximity. His voice carried a mixture of resignation and growing genuine warmth. Well, if one must be magically compelled to provide transportation for family member, at least my passenger is delightful company, whose happiness and whose obvious enjoyment both make this considerably more pleasant experience than pure humiliation or pure uncomfortable positioning might have created, if spell design and if targeting both lacked consideration about actual experience and actual mutual benefit beyond just comedic effect. Jade wrapped her arms loosely around his neck, her position secure and her obvious complete comfort, both communicating trust and affection. Thank you for being such good sport about this, Robert, and thank you for making this ridiculous situation feel more like adventure and more like bonding opportunity, rather than just being punishment or just being humiliating, imposition that resentment and discomfort both might characterize if different attitudes or different relationship dynamics made cooperation and finding joy both impossible accessing, despite absurdity and despite the genuine strangeness of spending entire day as human transportation. Professors Wexler and Crowley discovered themselves stripped of normal clothing and dressed only in women's undergarments. The lazy bras and the feminine underwear both creating effect that masculine dignity and scholarly gravitas both found profoundly mortifying, despite the garment's actual physical comfort and despite their actual adequate coverage, that modesty technically remained maintained even if aesthetic preferences and gender presentation both found the situation deeply problematic and deeply undermining of usual careful professional appearance. Wexler's voice carried mixture of intellectual analysis and genuine distress. This represents interesting examination of gender norms and masculine fragility, the discomfort arising not from actual physical state or actual practical problem, but rather from social conditioning and from internalized expectations about appropriate masculine presentation, that violation creates disproportionate emotional response compared to actual objective circumstances that really involve nothing more than wearing different style of clothing that function and coverage both adequately provide, despite aesthetic and social coding making experience feel more transgressive than rational analysis would support justifying. Crowley attempted transforming into his monstrous form, his demonic capabilities theoretically allowing escape from human clothing limitations and allowing different presentation that power and intimidation both would emphasize over any concerns about gendered garments. But the spell adapted, the feminine undergarment scaling and adjusting to accommodate his transformed state, the magical resilience and magical adaptability, both ensuring that regardless of form or regardless of attempted circumvention, the basic premise and basic humiliating presentation both persisted despite his considerable supernatural capability and despite his considerable motivation for finding workaround or finding escape from predicament. Sam and Dean Winchester discovered themselves magically adhered to ceiling, their bodies positioned horizontally as though gravity had simply reversed its polarity for them specifically, while leaving everything else functioning normally. They could move their limbs and could shift positions, but their torsos remained firmly attached to the ceiling surface, regardless of struggles or regardless of attempts at breaking free through force or through various supernatural remedies that their accumulated experience and their accumulated connections both suggested might prove effective for disrupting magical bindings. Sam's voice carried mixture of resignation and grudging appreciation. This is remarkably thorough binding spell, impressively resistant to conventional countermeasures, and impressively specific in its parameters for keeping us attached to ceiling, while allowing enough movement of circulation and comfort both remain adequate despite impossible positioning, and despite the considerable strangeness of experiencing reverse gravity that our equilibrium and our spatial awareness both struggle adapting to, despite our considerable experience with weird supernatural circumstances. Dina added his characteristic sarcastic response despite limited vocabulary and despite considerable discomfort about blood rushing to head and about general disorientation that inverted positioning inevitably created. At least we have good view of room, and at least we can observe the chaos unfolding below, making us simultaneously victims and audience for everyone else's various predicaments and various hilarious responses to their respective pranks that comprehensive targeting and ruthless creativity both made inevitable, experiencing rather than just observing from safe distance. All the vampires throughout Household, Aro and Victor and Craven and Theodore Kingsley, discovered themselves glittering with fabulous rainbow sheen that sparkles and prismatic light reflection both created through every movement and every gesture, catching light and refracting it in dazzling displays that disco balls and festival decorations both employed for maximum eye-catching effect. The effect remained constant regardless of lighting conditions, the magical enhancement ensuring that even in dim environments or in shadow, the sparkling remained visible and remain impossible to ignore or to minimize through strategic positioning or through careful movement. Aro's ancient features showed mixture of amusement and resignation. Well, this certainly represents creative interpretation of vampire folklore and creative commentary on certain popular cultural depictions that sparkling the vampires and teenage romance both made infamous despite traditionalists and despite purists, both finding such portrayal deeply problematic and deeply contrary to established mythology about vampires and about their natures. As prank targeting vampires specifically, acknowledging both traditional gravitas and modern popular culture interpretations, this demonstrates considerable sophistication and considerable awareness about multiple levels of meaning and multiple layers of comedy that reference and subversion together create. Victor's more serious nature found less humor in situation, his dignity and his considerable pride about appearance and about bearing, both making the fabulous sparkling considerably more difficult accepting with grace or accepting with good humor. This is profoundly undignified state for warrior and for ancient vampire whose reputation and whose carefully maintained image both emphasize power and emphasize danger, rather than emphasizing decorative qualities or emphasizing aesthetic appeal that sparkles and rainbow effects both communicate, contrary to any presentation that respects and appropriate fear both would demand maintaining. Theodore, whose more recent transformation and whose considerable adjustment to vampire nature both made him perhaps most adaptable of the group, found genuine amusement in the absurdity. At least we make quite spectacular impression, quite literally sparkling with personality, and quite literally impossible to overlook or to ignore when entering room or when participating in any activity. The comedy and the thorough undermining of traditional vampire aesthetic both create perfect prank that humor and genuine creativity together make worth enduring despite temporary damage to dignity, and despite inevitable teasing that such appearance will generate from other family members throughout day. The pirates, Captain Jack Sparrow and James Norrington and Cutler Beckett, discovered themselves unable to walk in straight lines. Their movements, reduced to clumsy zigzag patterns, that drunken staggering and complete lack of coordination, both made their locomotion appear, despite their minds and their balance both remaining perfectly intact within bodies that simply refused to cooperate with intentions about normal directed movement. Every attempt at walking forward resulted in lurching diagonal trajectory. Every attempt at turning or adjusting course, producing wild overcorrection that opposite direction and continued zigzag, both inevitably created regardless of concentration or regardless of conscious deliberate effort at controlling motion. Jack's voice carried his characteristic philosophical acceptance of absurdity. While this is certainly inconvenient for navigation, and certainly makes any attempt at dignified movement essentially impossible achieving, but at least the effect creates certain comedic charm, and creates certain memorable impression that normal walking and normal, boring, straight line trajectory could never adequately provide, despite their practical advantages and their considerably greater efficiency for actually reaching intended destinations within reasonable timeframes. Norrington's more rigid personality and his more serious nature both made the complete loss of coordinated movement considerably more frustrating. His usual precise military bearing and his usual emphasis on proper deportment both becoming completely impossible maintaining when body refused cooperation and when every motion became slapstick performance rather than controlled deliberate action. This is absolutely intolerable indignity that proper military discipline and that years of training both should protect against. Yet here I am, lurching about like common drunkard, without any ability to maintain proper bearing or maintain any semblance of control over my own basic locomotion. Beckett's calculating mind immediately began analyzing the pattern and attempting to predict trajectory for minimizing inefficiency and minimizing the considerable time that zigzag motion inevitably added to any attempted journey between locations. If one accounts for the angular deviation and for the overcorrection tendency, optimal strategy involves aiming considerably to one side of actual desired destination, allowing the zigzag pattern to average out toward actual target through multiple course corrections, rather than attempting futile direct approach that current locomotion makes essentially impossible achieving, regardless of determination or focus. Severus Snape, still glowing bright pink and still profoundly displeased about that particular indignity, had received a special authorization for pranking Sirius Black and had spent morning's early hours preparing elaborate sequence of magical effects that creativity and vindictive glee both had refined into comprehensive assault on dignity, that decades of animosity and years of accumulated grievances both made feel like proper outlet and proper revenge for countless past humiliations and countless past conflicts. His think form moved through castle with purpose, his wand moving through complex patterns as he activated prepared spells and as he triggered prepared effects that Sirius's current location and Sirius's current activities both made optimally vulnerable to disruption and to humiliation. Sirius woke to discover his animagus form had been altered. His usual large lab dog transformation, now producing bright purple poodle, with elaborate grooming and with decorative bows that dog shows and pampered pets, both typically received, despite such presentation being absolutely contrary to his usual rough, practical aesthetic, and absolutely contrary to his usual emphasis on appearing capable and appearing strong, rather than appearing decorative or appearing like someone's spoiled accessory. His attempts at transforming back into human form to escape the indignity produced no result, the spell holding him in modified animagus state, without ability to shift or to access human speech, or human hands that magic and countermeasures both typically would employ for defensive purposes. But Snape's revenge had only begun. Throughout the day, Sirius found himself subject to rolling series of pranks and indignities, each carefully timed and each carefully designed for maximum embarrassment and maximum disruption of any attempts at maintaining dignity or maintaining any control over circumstances. His purple poodle form found itself repeatedly compelled to perform tricks, sitting and rolling over and playing dead on command from Snape's pink form, whose obvious delight and whose obvious satisfaction both radiated from every gesture and every smug expression that revenge and vindication together created through sustained, comprehensive humiliation. Later in day, Snape's revenge escalated further. Magical compulsion making Sirius's human form emerge only to discover himself dressed in elaborate formal robes covered in pink hearts and sparkles. The ensemble so aggressively romantic and so aggressively contrary to his usual practical style that protest and outrage both struggled adequately expressing his horror at being magically clothed in such offensive garments without any apparent means for removing them or for accessing alternative wardrobe, that aesthetic preferences and basic dignity both demanded choosing rather than being forced to wear such ridiculous presentation. Snape's stink face showed genuine joy, his voice carrying satisfaction that decades of waiting and decades of accumulated resentment both made this moment feel like proper payoff and proper compensation. This represents a small fraction of the accumulated annoyance and accumulated grievance that your years of pranks and your years of mockery, both created as debt, requiring repayment through comprehensive humiliation, that creative freedom and explicit authorization both have finally permitted me, inflicting without restraint and without guilt, about excessive response or about violating household harmony that normal circumstances would demand, maintaining despite personal feelings and despite historical conflicts. Sirius's voice emerged with mixture of genuine distress and grudging acknowledgement that the elaborate revenge demonstrated impressive creativity and impressive dedication to thorough humiliation. I acknowledge your skill and acknowledge your thoroughness, Snape, while also noting my absolute lack of appreciation for being subjected to the sustained assault on dignity that your considerable magical talent and your considerable vindictive creativity together have crafted into comprehensive humiliation that escape and resistance both prove inadequate for avoiding or for minimizing despite my considerable motivation and despite my considerable accumulated experience, with pranks making me theoretically well equipped for defensive measures and countermeasures. Newt and the Gladers discovered themselves magically compelled to sing pop songs on endless loop, their voices taking turns and sometimes harmonizing through various hits from recent decades that catchiness and memorability both made simultaneously entertaining and absolutely maddening to perform repeatedly without break and without ability to stop, or to switch to different songs beyond whatever the magical compulsion selected for next iteration in endless rotation. Thomas attempted speaking between verses, tried communicating normally during brief instrumental sections, but the magic proved thorough and the magic proved relentless, his voice immediately launching into next song's opening lyrics whenever any gap appeared that speech might theoretically fit within. Minho's voice carried his characteristic sarcastic frustration as he launched into yet another pop chorus, his athletic frame and his usual confident movement both making the performance somehow more absurd through contrast between his appearance and his persona, and the aggressively cheerful mainstream music that his voice continued producing regardless of his obvious lack of enthusiasm and regardless of his obvious profound desire for the compulsion to end. This is genuinely one of the stranger forms of torture I have experienced, and given the maze and given Wake's various experiments and trials, that represents rather impressive achievement for simple magical prank to still qualify as uniquely unpleasant and uniquely maddening, despite considerably less actual danger or actual physical discomfort compared to past traumatic experiences. Gally found himself performing boy band choreography alongside the singing, his movements synchronized and his gestures coordinated despite having never learned such dances, and despite having absolutely zero interest in pop music or in performance that the compulsion nonetheless made him execute with perfect precision and perfect timing. His voice emerged rough with embarrassment between musical phrases. When this ends, when this finally releases and allows normal behavior resuming, I'm finding whoever designed this specific prank, and I'm having a very serious conversation about appropriate targeting and about boundaries that creativity and humor both should respect, rather than gleefully violating for sake of maximum embarrassment regardless of victims' particular sensitivities and particular areas of vulnerability. All the actors, Tom Hiddleston and Sebastian Stan, and Ryan Reynolds, and Tom Ellis, and Charlie Cox, and Vincent D'Onofrio, and Eldon Henson, and Kristen Ritter, and Chris Evans, and Robert Downey Jr., and Alan Rickman, and all others whose performance backgrounds and professional acting careers both made natural grouping, despite their various different specific circumstances and various different relationships to characters they have portrayed, discovered themselves able to speak only in lines from their most famous movie roles. Every attempt at normal conversation or normal expression produced instead quotations from screenplays, the dialogue emerging perfectly delivered with proper intonation and proper emotional contexts, despite complete disconnect from actual current circumstances or actual current intended communication. Tom Hiddleston attempted greeting Loki, tried articulating observation about his alternate self's current green Hulk-like predicament, but what emerged was smooth British delivery of memorable line. I am Loki of Asgard, and I'm burdened with glorious purpose. Loki's own response came as bellowed Hulk impression rather than his usual articulate reply. Hulk smash Cooney Loki. The recursive absurdity and the perfect comedic timing both made the exchange far funnier than either party found comfortable experiencing as participants rather than as observers. The humor and the frustration both competing for dominance as primary emotional response to predicament and to complete inability to communicate normally despite obvious attempts and despite obvious shared desire for actual conversation rather than performance of scripted material. Sebastian Stan found himself locked in similar loop with Bucky, his attempts at conversation with his portrayed character producing only Winter Soldier movie quotes that thematic relevance and emotional weight both made rather more intense than circumstances warranted. Who the hell is Bucky? Bucky's own response came as constitutionally mandated phrase, "We the people." Their usual easy friendship and their usual comfortable dynamic both became essentially impossible maintaining when linguistic limitations and when complete inability to express actual thoughts or actual feelings both reduced interaction to bizarre script reading that meaning and genuine communication both struggled, emerging from, despite their obvious mutual understanding and despite their obvious shared frustration about circumstances. Robert Downey Jr. discovered his Tony Stark limitations went beyond just color associations, his voice producing only Iron Man movie lines that sarcasm and technical brilliance both characterized in ways that his actual personality and actual speaking style made natural fit, despite the specific words and specific contexts being completely inappropriate for current actual circumstances. I am Iron Man. Also, I am very blue and very sad about being blue, while being Iron Man who is typically red and gold rather than blue and melancholy. The Council of Wells discovered themselves speaking only in minion language, the silly gibberish and the distinctive intonations both replacing their usual intellectual discourse and their usual complex scientific discussions with incomprehensible babbling that adorable and absurd both characterized it, despite their obvious continued attempts at normal conversation and their obvious continued attempts at coordinating their various genius level activities that Council's typical function and typical purpose both required maintaining, despite communication becoming essentially impossible beyond basic emotional tone and basic gesture. Harrison Wells from Earth 2 attempted explaining something about dimensional mechanics to his alternate selves, his mouth producing only streams of banana, apple, gelato, the sounds cheerful and the intonation somehow managing to convey frustration, despite the words themselves carrying no semantic content beyond the minion's characteristic food-obsessed exclamations. The other Wells variants showed similar struggles. Their various attempts at scientific collaboration and technical problem-solving, all devolving into elaborate exchanges of minion language, the gestures and exaggerated facial expressions both attempted, supplementing for actual communication despite the obvious limitations and despite their collective, considerable intelligence providing absolutely zero assistance when verbal expression itself became reduced to gibberish that meaning beyond emotional tone could not convey. On JTV and Pion 7 discovered themselves able to produce only one specific song. The original Pokemon anime theme that nostalgia and cultural impact both had, made iconic despite its relative simplicity and despite its specific narrow focus that sustained repetition, made it extremely tiresome, experiencing as performers rather than as casual listeners who could choose to stop or could choose alternative entertainment. Their voices launched into opening with involuntary enthusiasm, the lyrics and melody both emerging perfectly synchronized despite their obvious lack of desire for yet another repetition of song that they had already performed dozens of times since waking and discovering Predicament. John's voice carried his characteristic analytic enthusiasm, despite the repetitive content, his natural energy, and his genuine love for Pokemon, both making even magical compulsion to repeatedly sing theme, somehow aligned with his personality, enough that the experience felt less torturous, and more just extremely inconvenient, compared to others' predicaments, but fundamental opposition between compulsion and actual preferences made considerably more unpleasant enduring. I want to be the very best, like no one ever was. To catch them is my real test. To train them is my cause. Michael joined for chorus, his voice harmonizing despite both clearly wishing they could just have normal conversation about Pokemon or about anything else rather than being permanently stuck in a musical loop that novelty and nostalgia both had long since exhausted through repetition. I will travel across the land, searching far and wide. Teach Pokemon to understand the power that's inside. Robert Englund had received his special authorization for pranking Wes Craven, his old friend and longtime collaborator whose directing and whose creative vision both had made Nightmare on Elm Street franchise possible, and both had given Robert the role that would define his career and would make him legendary within horror community, despite the various complications and various strange mixed feelings that such association inevitably created. He approached the task with genuine affection, mixing with creative mischief, his pranks targeting Wes, focusing more on humor and on nostalgia, rather than on humiliation or on genuine discomfort that their friendship and their mutual respect both made inappropriate pursuits, despite explicit permission and despite explicit encouragement for creative freedom. Wes discovered himself surrounded by practical effect recreations of iconic moments from their various films together, the props and the setups all appearing spontaneously throughout his day and creating recursive commentary about their work and about their creative partnership. Miniature Freddy gloves appeared in his coffee cup. Fake blood effects triggered at unexpected moments. Animatronic creatures from various films emerged from closets and from unexpected locations, creating jump scares and creating absurdist callbacks that their history and their accumulated body of work both made rich territory for referential humor and affectionate mockery. Robert's voice carried warmth when he revealed himself as architect of the day's various surprises. Wes, my friend, my collaborator, my partner in creating nightmares that entertained millions and terrified children across multiple generations, this day represents my love letter to our work and my appreciation for your vision that made me the icon I became despite my own contributions and despite my own creative choices, obviously playing role as well in shaping character and shaping franchise. Wes's laughter emerged genuine and appreciative. Recognition that Robert's pranks demonstrated deep understanding about their relationship and demonstrated genuine affection beneath the mischief. You magnificent bastard, you actually managed to recreate half our filmography in miniature form for sake of elaborate day-long prank that references and in-jokes both make considerably more meaningful and considerably more touching than surface absurdity might suggest to outside observers, lacking our context and lacking our history. Tony Stark had received similar authorization for pranking Doctor Strange, the genius inventor's complicated friendship with the Sorcerer Supreme, and their accumulated years of banter and rivalry, both making him natural candidate for such focused attention and natural target for comprehensive magical and technological assault on dignity. Tony's blue form moved through workshop assembling devices and preparing spells, his limited vocabulary making planning somewhat challenging, but not preventing his considerable creativity and his considerable vindictive genius from devising appropriate revenge and appropriate elaborated humiliation. Strange discovered his cloak of levitation had been reprogrammed, the normally loyal artifact now responding to Tony's commands rather than to Strange's own intentions, the sentient garment gleefully participating in pranking its usual master through following Tony's instructions about positioning Strange in ridiculous poses and about preventing Strange from accessing his spell components or accessing his various mystical implements. The cloak wrapped around Strange like burrito, his arms pinned and his movements severely restricted despite his considerable magical power and despite his considerable authority, theoretically making such insubordination impossible. His voice emerged muffled through fabric. Stark, when this day ends and when normalcy returns, you and I will have extended conversation about boundaries and about appropriate limitations that rivalry and friendship both should observe, rather than completely abandoning for sake of comprehensive humiliation that your considerable creativity and your explicit authorization both have permitted, indulging. Tony's response came through blue limited vocabulary. Sky blue genius, sad happy genius, ocean blue cloak napping, sky sadness and joyful blue mischief, ocean of blue genius satisfaction. Strange somehow managed to look both profoundly irritated and reluctantly amused despite his current burrito-wrapped predicament. Recognition that Tony's prank demonstrated considerable creativity and demonstrated genuine effort despite linguistic limitations, making planning and execution both considerably more challenging than normal circumstances would create. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles discovered themselves each transformed into solid color matching their respective masks. Leonardo rendered completely blue, Raphael completely red, Donatello completely purple, and Michelangelo completely orange. But beyond the monochromatic appearance, their speech had been limited to words associated with their respective colors, each brother struggling to communicate using only vocabulary that color associations and color-related concepts both made available, while excluding everything else regardless of relevance or importance for actual intended communication. Leonardo attempted giving tactical instructions, tried coordinating team response to simultaneous pranks affecting the entire household, but his blue limited vocabulary made specific, detailed planning essentially impossible. Blue sky, blue water, blue strategic ocean of blue tactics and blue coordination through blue leadership, and blue team unity. Raphael's red limitation made his usual angry responses considerably more colorful and made his characteristic hostility somehow more visceral through association with blood and fire and violence. Red hot rage about red crimson embarrassment, creating red burning desire for red revenge against whoever red designed these red pranks, requiring red endurance through red day of red indignity. Donatello's purple vocabulary made technical discussions possible, but awkward. Purple technical solutions using purple scientific methods, requiring purple equipment and purple coordination, despite purple limitations and purple challenges that purple predicament creates for purple problem solving. Michelangelo's orange limitation actually aligned fairly well with his characteristic energy and enthusiasm. Orange awesome dude, orange party time, with orange totally radical orange fun, despite orange bizarre orange situation, requiring orange adaptation and orange acceptance, that orange everything is orange now. Barry Allen discovered himself transformed into slowest man on earth. His movements reduced to exaggerated slow motion that every gesture and every step both required extended time, completing despite his conscious experience of time passing normally, making the disconnect between intention and execution profoundly frustrating. His attempts at normal activities became performance art and patience, each simple task requiring minutes or hours that fractions of seconds would normally suffice for accomplishing. But the spell's cruelty extended beyond just Barry himself. The rest of Team Flash, Cisco and Caitlin and Iris and Joe, all discovered themselves granted super speed that matched or exceeded Barry's zonal capabilities, their movements becoming blurs and their actions completing almost instantaneously, despite their complete lack of training or experience with such velocity that coordination and control, both theoretically, should require developing before safe, effective use became possible. Cisco's voice emerged so rapidly that comprehension became challenging despite his words being individually clear. This is simultaneously coolest thing ever and completely terrifying, having speed without training or without proper understanding about momentum and about friction and about all technical considerations that physics and that actual super speed both demand respecting for avoiding disaster or avoiding unintentional destruction through insufficient control or insufficient awareness about capabilities and limitations. Iris attempted approaching Barry to check on him, her super speed making her movements blur and making her accidentally overshoot her target by considerable distance before managing to awkwardly slow down in reverse direction. Her voice carried a mixture of exhilaration and genuine concern. Barry, honey, this is what you experience constantly? This is your normal baseline perception and capability? No wonder you seem so impatient sometimes, and no wonder normal speed seems frustratingly slow when this represents your actual lived experience every single day. Lucifer Morningstar discovered himself subjected to arguably most comprehensive and most visually striking prank affecting anyone in household. His appearance transformed into sparkling pink coloration, that fabulous and completely contrary to his usual sophisticated aesthetic. Both made the effect particularly devastating for someone whose entire identity and whose entire carefully maintained image both emphasized dark elegance and subtle sensuality rather than cheerful, colorful sparkles that children's entertainment and obviously magical creatures both employed. But the prank included additional elements that made the indignity even more comprehensive and even more impossible to escape or minimize. A personal rain cloud followed him everywhere, constantly drizzling glitter down onto his pink sparkly form and creating trail of shimmering particles that marked his passage and made stealth or unobtrusive movements completely impossible at tempting. His voice carried a mixture of genuine distress and grudging appreciation for prank's thoroughness. This is a remarkably comprehensive attack on dignity and remarkably effective at completely undermining every aspect of carefully maintained presentation that sophistication and dark elegance both typically ensure creates proper impression and creates proper atmosphere around my presence. I simultaneously loathe this with burning passion while also acknowledging the artistic merit and the obvious considerable effort that such complete transformation required executing successfully. Tom Ellis experienced sympathetic reaction to his character's predicament, his own appearance shifting to match Lucifer's pink sparkly presentation, despite his being actor rather than actual devil, making such sympathetic connection theoretically unnecessary and theoretically representing additional layer of prank beyond just targeting Lucifer himself. The two of them stood together, both pink and both sparkling and both followed by glitter clouds, the image so perfectly absurd and so perfectly undermining that their considerable combined charm and their considerable combined presence both became completely neutralized through ridiculous coloring and ridiculous atmospheric effects. Tom's voice carried his characteristic good humor despite circumstances. Well, at least we match. At least our shared predicament creates certain solidarity and creates certain opportunity for commiserating about indignity and about complete loss of cool, sophisticated image that we both typically rely upon for various social and professional purposes. The day progressed with continued chaos and continued laughter, as various family members discovered their predicaments, and as various interactions between victims created additional comedy through combinations, and through unexpected effects that individual pranks alone would not produce, but that comprehensive simultaneous targeting made inevitable encountering. The monitoring screens showed split views of dozens of simultaneous situations, the footage capturing reactions and capturing various attempts at adaptation or circumvention that creativity and desperation both motivated pursuing, despite magical protections and technological safeguards, making reversal or escape essentially impossible until predetermined time when all effects would simultaneously lift and normalcy would return. Jade moved through household carried by Robert, her position providing excellent vantage point for observing chaos and for checking on various victims, ensuring that everyone remained safe and that no one experienced genuine distress beyond appropriate temporary embarrassment or appropriate temporary inconvenience. Her laughter rang out frequently, the joy and the satisfaction about successful elaborate prank both evident through her expression and through her obvious delight at seeing plans and preparations come to fruition exactly as intended. Angelina accompanied them, her maternal concern ensuring that boundaries and safety both remained respected despite chaos and despite comprehensive nature-making oversight and monitoring both essential for preventing genuine problems or genuine emotional harm that poorly targeted pranks or excessive humiliation might create if inadequate consideration and inadequate care guided choices. Her voice carried approval, mixing with continued vigilance. The pranks demonstrate remarkable creativity and remarkable understanding about individual personalities, targeting specific vulnerabilities and specific sensibilities, while maintaining appropriate limits and maintaining actual safety, despite surface chaos and despite genuine discomfort that various effects create through their thorough nature and through their comprehensive undermining of usual presentations. Master Splinter found himself amused observer rather than victim, his wisdom and his accumulated experience with chaos both making him appreciate the elaborate planning and appreciate the obvious care that safety and reversibility both received, despite the prank's thorough nature and despite their comprehensive targeting. His gentle voice carried approval when he articulated assessment. This represents healthy family bonding through shared absurdity and through collective vulnerability, making everyone equal through ridiculous predicaments and through genuine temporary loss of dignity that hierarchies and power dynamics both yield to during such moments, creating genuine community rather than just coexistence based on respect for capabilities or respect for status. The afternoon brought various attempted coordinations and attempted group activities that victims' various limitations and victims' various predicaments both made considerably more challenging than normal circumstances would create. Meal preparation became elaborate comedy, as those with limited vocabularies and those with altered physical states both attempted contributing while adapting to constraints and while finding creative workarounds that determination and cooperation together made possible despite obvious difficulties. Severus Snape's pink form moved through kitchen with as much dignity as circumstances permitted, his continued authorization for pranking Sirius providing some compensation for his own indignity through allowing continued creative revenge throughout day. He triggered another prepared spell, Sirius's purple poodle form suddenly finding itself dressed in elaborate tutu and compelled to perform ballet movements that grace and precision both characterized despite Sirius's complete lack of training and despite his obvious profound mortification about performing such elaborate choreographed dance while his canine form and his ridiculous outfit both made the display simultaneously impressive and completely humiliating. Snape's voice carried satisfaction that sustained revenge and comprehensive humiliation, both granted as appropriate payback for decades of accumulated grievances. Dance black, dance for my amusements, and dance for everyone's entertainment, while your dignity and your usual confident presentation both dissolve into this perfect moment of comprehensive humiliation that creative freedom and explicit authorization both have finally permitted me inflicting without guilt and without restraint. The children maintained their exclusion from direct prank effects, but they observed the chaos with obvious delight and obvious fascination about adults, and about powerful beings all reduced to various ridiculous states that laughter and entertainment both made the day feel more like celebration than like actual punishment or actual targeted cruelty, despite the Monza comprehensive nature and despite the obvious discomfort that various effects created. Nicholas articulated the children's collective perspective when he observed the general situation and attempted synthesizing lesson or meaning beyond just surface comedy. This shows that everyone can be silly and everyone can be vulnerable sometimes, regardless of power or capability, that laughing together and being ridiculous together actually makes families stronger and makes trust deeper, because everyone shares the embarrassment and everyone participates in chaos rather than some people being above or being exempt, creating hierarchy that genuine equality and genuine community both require eliminating through such comprehensive shared experiences. The evening approached gradually as effects continued and as various victims adapted to their circumstances with varying degrees of success and varying degrees of grace. Some found humor and found opportunities for creative expression within limitations, while others maintained grumpy, dignified suffering that eventually would end and eventually would restore normalcy, making endurance primary strategy rather than attempting to find silver lining or attempting to enjoy circumstances that genuine discomfort and genuine embarrassment both made difficult appreciating despite intellectual recognition about temporary nature and about actual harmlessness beyond dignity and beyond comfort, both receiving temporary setbacks. As sun began setting, as predetermined endpoint approached for simultaneous reversal and restoration, Jake called for general gathering in main hall where everyone could witness the lifting and could share final moments of collective experience before normalcy returned and before individual predicaments became stories rather than current reality. The assembly created spectacular visual chaos, the various colors and effects and limitations all combining into tableau that impossibility and absurdity both characterized, despite every individual present representing genuine conscious being whose actual experience and actual feelings both demanded respect, despite ridiculous appearances and despite ridiculous circumstances. Nathan's cameras captured the moment as countdown reached zero, as carefully programmed and carefully timed reversal triggered simultaneously across all effects and across all victims, restoring normalcy and restoring usual capabilities in single coordinated moment that relief and renewed appreciation for normal functioning both make feel dramatic, despite actually just being returned to baseline. That temporary alteration made seemed special through contrast and through recognition about what had been missing during prank's duration. Hair colors returned to normal, Janice's golden form shifted back to usual pale aesthetic. Linguistic limitations lifted, allowing normal speech resuming. Physical constraints released their holds, and various other effects all simultaneously dissolved, leaving behind only memories and documentation rather than continued alteration or continued limitations. The collective sigh of relief mixed with genuine laughter about shared experience and about very specific memorable moments that retelling and remembering both would make legendary family stories passed down and shared repeatedly. Severus Snape's pink coloration faded last, the spell holding few seconds longer than others through Jake's specific request that his particular indignity receive extended duration as gentle reminder about his own enthusiastic participation in planning and about his own considerable satisfaction from pranking Sirius throughout day. His expression showed he recognized the justice and recognized the symmetry despite his continued lack of appreciation for having been pink even temporarily. His voice emerged with a mixture of resignation and grudging acknowledgement. I suppose extended duration represents fair price for having received such comprehensive authorization and such enjoyable opportunity for revenge against Black, making my own temporary indignity acceptable cost for the considerable satisfaction that sustained creative pranking throughout entire day provided as outlet for accumulated grievances and accumulated desire for payback. The gathering transformed into impromptu celebration, the shared experience and the shared survival, both creating renewed bonds and renewed appreciation for family and for the genuine trust and genuine security that allowed such comprehensive chaos without destroying relationships or creating lasting resentments that boundaries and respect both protected against despite surface impression that such elaborate pranking might create genuine harm or genuine lasting discomfort beyond temporary embarrassment and temporary inconvenience. Welcome to understanding that families who could prank together and laugh together possess strength and security that such vulnerability and such shared absurdity both demonstrated beyond what words alone could convey. Welcome to recognition that comprehensive chaos and universal temporary indignity actually serve bonding and actually serve trust through proving that safety and acceptance both remain constant regardless of circumstances and regardless of temporary loss of dignity or temporary loss of control. The Great Prank Back Revengeance had concluded successfully, leaving behind tired family and spectacular documentation and memories that retelling and shared laughter both was sustained across years as perfect example of their unique bond and their unique capacity for joy even during chaos and even during comprehensive universal humiliation that love and mind, trust together, transformed into celebration rather than allowing it becoming a source of genuine distress or genuine lasting harm. And somewhere in an impossible castle between realities, 61 adults and 15 children settled into evening with renewed appreciation for each other and with renewed recognition that they had built something truly special that pranks and chaos both served strengthening rather than threatening when proper foundation and proper genuine care ensured that laughter and love both remain primary constants regardless of temporary circumstances or temporary alterations that magic and mischief together could create for entertainment and for memorable bonding experiences.